East Jerusalem, where Palestinians have shopped and lived for centuries, bringing their produce from the fields, making families, talking with tourists, getting married, and raising their kids. And, since 1967, being occupied by Israel. Let us take a Palestinian tour of the occupation that has gone on for over 30 years.
It's very tense here. There is a war going on, except it's one-sided war. The Palestinians no match to the Israeli firing power. At any time, the Israelis could do what they are doing now, isolate all the Palestinian towns and villages, and have total military control.
Now, why did we have to park 3 miles away in that case? We had to park, and then a Palestinian driver drove us here.
Yes.
What was that all about? Why did that happen that way?
Well, it's because the Israelis consider Bethlehem today a closed military area. This means that no Palestinian or international people can come in Bethlehem or outside Bethlehem. So it is like a jail, you know.
Well, so we had to go to the border and then be brought in by a taxi driver. I mean, we got in.
Well, the Israelis don't want you to be in. You see, you have Palestinian people who helped you in.
Oh, I see.
In spite or despite the will of the Israelis, you know.
So that was, we sort of snuck in a
yes,
way. Yeah,
yes, you have to jump over the fence.
Yeah.
Because all the gates are closed. Yeah, you just jumped. So you didn't go the Orthodox way. You went through the neo-Orthodox way.
Yes, right. I understand. That's right.
And then you get into the issue of, it's not an issue of territory, it's an issue of control. The assumption is the more territory they get, the more sovereignty they get. But that's not the case at all. It has to do with, again, with issues of control of borders, control of airspace, the chance to develop a coherent economy, real sovereignty, borders. Israel doesn't need 40% to control the West Bank. It doesn't even need more than 5% to control the West Bank.
Israeli journalist Amira Hess talks about the right to be spontaneous. Nobody thinks about Palestinians from the West Bank who want to get up on a Saturday morning and go to the beach. There's no right for Palestinians to get up and go to the beach. We as human rights organizations are focusing on the most critical human tragedies taking place.
B'Tselem, the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the Occupied Territories. B'Tselem was established in 1989 by a group of prominent academics, attorneys, journalists, and Knesset members. It endeavors to document and educate the Israeli public and policymakers about human rights violations in the occupied territories, combat the phenomenon of denial prevalent among the Israeli public, and help create a human rights culture in Israel. Director Jessica Montel.
With the start of this intifada, movement for Palestinians has just become a nightmare because of the way that jurisdiction has been divided among the West Bank. And now within the West Bank, even to travel 10 miles down the road, Palestinians may have to go through 3 Israeli checkpoints and be refused entry at any one of those. The entire Palestinian population is under these extreme restrictions on movement. I mean, I and almost every other Israeli goes about my daily life basically with no restrictions as a result of this conflict. That's not the case for virtually every Palestinian. Families have been confined in their homes under curfew for days and weeks and months at a time. That's exactly the opposite of the human rights message, that every individual has that basic b'tselem, that basic human dignity. So we talk about the person who needs urgent medical care and files a request for a permit and then has a delay, and then finally they get the permit for their urgent medical care. It's clear that if you continue injustices against a population, you're not going to build a lasting solution to the conflict.
Since 1967, over 18,000 Palestinian homes have been demolished, leaving tens of thousands of Palestinian families, just like these, homeless. All this to make room for Jewish-only settlements and bypass roads. Can you touch on why these homes are demolished?
That's the thing. It's all within the framework of the occupation. They're really demolished because Israel is trying to contain the Palestinians inside these little islands and to keep most of the West Bank and East Jerusalem free for Israeli settlement and Israeli roads and so on. So it's a control mechanism. Now it's all done under a legal pretext. You know, they just don't go demolish. I mean, it's very important, this whole democratic facade. So that there's zoning policies and there's planning policies. You know, you have to get a permit to build a house, and of course Palestinians aren't given permits, but they're not given permits because they're Palestinians. They're not given permits because, and then there's 50 different reasons. It's too close to a settlement, it's too close to a road, you can't prove ownership. I mean, there's a million different things. The bottom line is that while Israel's built probably 90,000 housing units for Jews on the West Bank and East Jerusalem since '67, no Palestinian building at all is permitted. It's the policy of the civil administration which runs the West Bank not to give building permits to Palestinians. That's the official policy.
Homes are also destroyed by Israeli bombs and rockets, all supplied by the United States. Palestinian families are forcibly removed from their homes, often at gunpoint. It's the official policy.
The media covers the Palestinians as numbers. 8 people were killed yesterday. 7 people were killed the day before yesterday. It's not names, it's not people, but try to remember that every single person who is dying because they want to have freedom, they want to have a country where they can live in dignity, what remains of a country that we have conceded, of course. But they have families. They are children of God themselves.
Why the USA government don't help Palestinian people?
We are really experiencing every single day another kind of injustice caused against the Palestinians. The plight of the Palestinian people, I feel, because I'm a refugee myself, so we know what it is to suffer. But out of that suffering, we're trying to overcome that suffering so that it will not be repeated again, not to us, not to anybody else. The power of justice is above the power of guns.
Who bring him to here? Let him will live here. The government of Israel. The government, the military of the Israelis will can take him back. But America, she doesn't want to do anything. America, she making a game to the Palestinian people. If you have all the money and you don't have any freedom, what you can do in your money? What you can do in your money if you don't have any freedom?
And here there is another concrete block, you see, to the left of the road. And supposedly it's supposed to be in the middle, but people keep pushing things away, and the army comes and put them in the middle of the road. This is the blockade. It's supposed to go straight.
What you can do in your money if you don't have any freedom?
What exactly is the goal of Zionism? Because I mean, in one respect, if it was to say we want a safe place to live, that's one thing. But if it's to say, but we want a state for Jews only, I mean, kind of an extreme definition, then you sort of unwind the whole thing.
That's right. That's right. You know, look, I think Zionism made sense because, you know, it was formed at a time 100 years ago. I mean, the world's population was a lot smaller. It was a bigger world. And you had the idea, the nation-state idea in Europe, was that, you know, the world is comprised of discrete nations. And so every nation, simply for reasons of coordination, really, political, every nation had a right to a state, or had to have a state in order to have international systems. A state would encompass a pure nation. The Serbs would have their nation. The Croatians would have their nation. The Ukrainians would have their nation. You know, the French, it was before modern mass migrations and everything else. So that there was a logic to it in a sense. But what was logical and made sense 50, 100 years ago, today it's interesting. The whole idea of a state for your own people becomes, in the modern sense, ethnic cleansing.
The official Israeli narrative, the official Israeli historiography told us that the population of Palestine was called upon by its own leaders and by leaders from other Arab countries to leave and make way for the invading Arab armies, and with a promise to come back after the victory would be secured. This is, for me, the most fascinating and tragic part of the story. Now, Betty Morris, who is a very thorough researcher, went to Special Archives, which is in London, where the British have monitored every broadcast that was in the air in those days, ever since 1936. And he found no proof to any such message coming in the radio. There was no television. Coming in the air, and I found no evidence for anything in writing. And in fact, we know now for sure there was no such call. There was an Israeli propaganda myth to say that the Arab leaders called upon the population to leave. And they wanted to develop this myth because they wanted to hide the fact that they have decided in March 1948 to expel the indigenous population of Palestine. Now we're talking here about 900,000 people who lived for hundreds of years, if not thousands of years. And when the war ends, 500 villages are destroyed, 11 towns are gone, 750,000, maybe 800,000 out of 900,000 become refugees. They own most of the land in Palestine. The land is being confiscated by the Jewish state. They have no property rights anymore, no land rights. Their houses were looted, and their careers were stopped. And it was a real human tragedy on a large scale, And the main responsibility, according to my historical research, lies with those people who decided to expel them, the Zionist leadership. First and foremost, we have David Ben-Gurion, who was the chairman of the executive committee of the Jewish Agency and later the first prime minister of Israel, a very powerful man. Most of the crucial decisions have to go through him. But he had people who supported him. Yigal Allon and Moshe Dayan, very young general, but very eager to ethnically cleanse Palestine, Israel Galili, Eliezer Kaplan, who was a kind of a finance minister. And Mr. Transfer himself, as they called him Mr. Transfer, was someone called Yosef Weitz, who was responsible for the development and settlement section in the Jewish agency. His duty before the war was to look at the Arab territories and say which is the fertile land, which part of the Jewish agency will take the land, and so on. He had transfer committees, official committees, which dealt in each region with how to execute the transfer and what to do after the transfer. If they can cause people to flee, that's the best. If they have to put people on trucks and transfer them, that's all right. If they have to massacre people in order to intimidate them into a flight, that's okay as well. I realized that, contrary to the Israeli official historiography, that there was only one massacre in Deir Yassin. I realized that there were dozens of massacres. I once remarked that even a peace-loving movement like the Quakers, had they been in such a similar situation, would have admitted to more than one massacre. It's so ridiculous that the Israelis thought that they can sort of be let off with their own official history by saying, yes, of course, one massacre did take place, which is ridiculous. I wrote about it for the first time in 1988, 1989, and I'm rewriting now a new book about the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, because I realized how little do we still know about it.
If you had something you wanted to tell American people, what would you tell them?
I tell them to visit Gaza or visit Palestinian cities and see what is really happening in our country. Yeah.
If you could say something to the American president,
I hope to see him and talk with him to say to him, what we are suffering from. We are suffering of many things. Israeli people occupied our country, occupied our lands, and every problem we are suffering from, this is as a result of this thing. Yes.
Why the America used the veto when the Palestinian wanted the international community to help to achieve the justice and the peace in this land? We want peace. We are not terrorists.
The whole world is critical of Israeli policies, and the United States is just absolutely uncritically pro-Israel, the Congress. All the time you have votes in the UN that it's 140 nations for some resolution, and the United States, Israel, and Micronesia are vote against or veto or whatever. So if you're pro-Israeli, even mildly, it's cost-free. In other words, it's a position you have that doesn't hurt you. If you're pro-Palestine, if you're seen at, now there's another thing, that's AIPAC, the American Jewish lobby on Israel. AIPAC gives almost to every congressperson and senator who is considered a friend of Israel. You have a certain voting record, you're a friend of Israel, or you're in a very key position, you can get $200,000, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000. I mean, it's a very significant sum. And of course, to be in some areas and to be labeled as not a friend of Israel or as pro-Palestinian or something costs you a lot. So the congressmen say basically, look, it just doesn't pay in terms of all the issues that exist to take a pro-Palestinian position.
As a matter of fact, this lobby have soured the relationship between the United States and all Arab and Islamic countries because of an American policy that has really been very, very unfair to Palestinians, to Arabs, and to Muslims.
First, I would say that it's important to be informed and to know what's going on. Certainly the United States is implicated in what's going on in the Middle East, and it's worthwhile for Americans to know what's being done also in their name. That's a message that we give to the Israeli public as well. You need to know what's going on in your name, and you need to take a position on that. That also holds true for Americans. And again, to say that there's a role to be played by the international community, and particularly by friends of Israel. The most effective criticism that Israel is able to hear is criticism from its friends. Obviously, there's a lot of targeting of Israel by people who are opposed to the state of Israel, anti-Semites who are targeting Israel. That's not effective criticism, and Israel is very good at retreating into a defensive position when it feels itself to be under attack.
Any criticism on the policies of Israel is hampered and made impossible by a terrible trick and crime of Israeli propaganda, that any criticism on the politics of Israel comes out, is induced by anti-Semitic feelings. And our main purpose is to show to the world that we are Jews, and we are conscious Jews. We, in a way, we are proud of our Jewish heritage, not of our Jewish presence, but of our Jewish heritage. And we want to show that you must criticize Israel if you at all want anything good for the Jews in the world, because what Israel is doing is destroying the Jewish world and the Jewish heritage.
So because of that, friends of Israel, people who say, we recognize that Jews have basic rights like everyone else, Israelis have basic rights like everyone else, at the same time, you have to recognize the same thing about the Palestinians. We call on all governments to make human rights a central part of their foreign policy. It's clear that for the United States, definitely in terms of Israel and other places in terms of the world, human rights is not one of the first priorities in terms of their foreign policy, or the second or third or fourth priority.
At about 9:15 our time, so that's about 10 minutes ago, local. Number of loud explosions, I counted about 3 or 4 explosions, and then a great deal of smoke coming up. From all accounts, it's coming from north of Manger Square, around the Church of the Nativity scene.
Our Palestinian tour continues as we run headlong into the Israeli incursion and siege of the West Bank.
They are killed. The bodies, they found the IDs in the trousers and they killed them.
Israel has a legal right and an obligation to defend its citizens. The military offensives in March and April, which have caused tremendous suffering for the Palestinian civilian population, are justified on that grounds. If they are justified in going into refugee camps to arrest suspects, to round up weapons, to confiscate explosives, the way they have conducted these operations it clearly is a violation of international humanitarian provisions. We documented a shocking number of cases of shooting at ambulances, preventing ambulances from getting access to wounded people. In the month of March, 6 medical personnel, doctors, paramedics, were killed in ambulances while going about their duties. In some cases, after they had already made all of the arrangements with Israel, had permission to move from one place to another to bring medical supplies or to get access to wounded people, and then were shot at and killed. The phenomenon of suicide bombers is inconceivable to me. To think of young people with their whole lives ahead of them, willing to turn themselves into a weapon in order to kill other civilians. The sense of hopelessness and despair is what is feeding the willingness of Palestinians to be suicide bombers. At the same time, Israel cannot bring security to its own citizens without ending the occupation, that a military solution to terrorism in these circumstances is doomed to failure as long as the occupation and all of the humiliations and abuses and despair continue.
The entire Palestinian population in Gaza and the West Bank are locked into Gaza, the West Bank. Some people say, so what? I mean, why do they need to go into Israel anyway? Well, we have to look at the context. Since 1967, the Israelis have confiscated over 60% of Palestinian land in the West Bank. And the Palestinian economy was mostly land-based. Without the land, Palestinians were forced to be day laborers in Israel. And that was a primary source of income. In addition, under occupation, the Israeli military never allowed the Palestinians to develop an independent and viable economy in the West Bank and Gaza. So Palestinians were always dependent on money and income from working in Israel, most of them. In 1993, with the Oslo process, unfortunately, the Israelis implemented the closure, which shut the doors to Israel. And so hundreds and thousands of Palestinians suddenly became unemployed. And there was no alternative source of employment. During the Oslo process, unemployment tripled. That's during the peace process, unemployment tripled. And by the beginning of the Intifada, we have 1 million Palestinians living under the poverty line. And this is not a poor country. This is a country that always had a reasonable standard of living. I would lift the closure. To me, the closure is a source of this humility and of a source of the need to resort to anything, to using your body, anything to protest the oppression. A man with 7 kids and no job, nothing to feed his kids, he will eventually go blow himself up. We've already seen the phenomenon of women now going and blowing themselves up. Why? I mean, they're using the last thing left to them to scream out, to protest. They're using their bodies. And I would lift the closure because, and just for an example, in the first Intifada, there was no closure. Palestinians were in and out of the West Bank. They were in Jerusalem, in Tel Aviv, in Haifa, working all over. They were at the beaches. There wasn't one suicide bombing. Suicide bombing started with the closure.
The desert breeze kisses my face, a breath of love to comfort the ache.
When traveling through the occupied territory, the Palestinian way, it takes only 5 minutes to realize that it will take you more than 2.5 hours to make a 20-minute trip. Blockades and checkpoints stop Palestinians from going anywhere easily. They must carry their goods over the blockades to get to the other side. They must cross highways that would, if they could use them, certainly make their lives easier. But these highways are reserved for Israeli settlers only. Every day, the simple supplies of a society, food and water, medicine and school supplies, must be hand-carried over these blockades, only to meet with other blockades, ditches, and checkpoints on the other side. This is living the Palestinian way.
Desert breeze kisses my face, a breath of love to comfort the ache.
Today, the rule is no free movement with almost no exception. Beginning in 1991, Israel imposed checkpoints along the borders between the occupied territories and Israel. Palestinians had to have permits to enter Israel. Beginning 18 months ago, Israel put up checkpoints throughout the West Bank and also in the Gaza Strip now, and Palestinians no longer have free movement even inside those territories. We document a case of a Palestinian needing to get to a hospital or needing to get to work or school and not able to. Israelis understand that to be someone trying to travel from Ramallah to Tel Aviv. In fact, a Palestinian trying to travel from Bir Zayt to Ramallah, both in the West Bank, 10 miles down the road from each other, will not be able to make that journey today. Israel has imposed a series of checkpoints and blocks and trenches in the roads. I mean, a whole network that prevents any free movement from Palestinians. In some cases, Palestinians get to a checkpoint that is, soldiers are standing at the checkpoint, and the soldiers either let them go through or don't let them go through. In many, many cases, there's no one even to argue with because you're talking about huge piles of concrete or trenches in the ground. A Palestinian needing to get to a hospital can't even plead their case. They're just simply, trapped in their village with no way out.
There's a basic dilemma here that Israel is facing in terms of the occupied territories. And that is it wants to control the whole area between the Jordan and the Mediterranean. But you've got 3 million Palestinians living in the occupied territories, 2 million in the West Bank and 1 million in Gaza. Now, if you made it one country, even if it was under Israeli domination, and you didn't give the Palestinian citizenship, you'd have apartheid. So the trick is, how do we keep control but relieve ourselves of that Palestinian population by creating a mini-state? A state that will get rid of the Palestinians. They'll be in their state. We don't have to give them citizenship. We don't have to give them services. We're free of them to continue with our Israel as a Jewish state, but that does not threaten, in fact, our control.
I think the Israelis are still part of this mentality of preserving a Jewish majority. And in any other place in the world, preserving an ethnic majority would be distasteful. And here, it's the norm. And we have something called Judaization of the Galilee, to bring more Jews to live in the Galilee. That's the opposite of Judenrein, which was the Nazi policy of emptying areas of Jews. I mean, we have mirror images of what Jewish oppression was and what, today oppression by the Israeli Jewish state is.
Allegra Pacheco is a Jewish Israeli attorney who represents Palestinians in Israeli military courts and Supreme Court.
I think one of the problems with Israelis is when they say, we just want to have peace and that's it. It's not so simple, because 10 minutes from here in the middle of Jerusalem are 100,000 people living under curfew. You can't just have peace and that's it, while there are hundreds and thousands of people being oppressed. The Israelis can't say they didn't know. This is all out in the media. And basically what they really want, in my opinion, is they want to preserve their privilege, their privileged lifestyle.
We've been involved in a 100-year process of displacement. This is our land that belongs to the Jewish people exclusively. There was never an attempt, unfortunately, to come to grips with who's living in this country. The fact that there are Palestinians. Until today, the word Palestinian is not used often in Israel. You talk about Arabs. So the Arabs are kind of an undifferentiated mass with no character, with no rights of their own, with no collective identity. But it doesn't matter because they're just kind of background. And the important enterprise is the enterprise of establishing a Jewish state and so on.
In 1948, we were brought up to believe in Israel that this was a war between a Davis and a Goliath. And because the Davis succeeded against all odds to win the 1948 war, it produced the myth of the invincible Israeli army, which meant the Israelis felt that they were Superman. And you can see how the same myth about the invincibility, the total superiority of the Israeli army affected the Israeli myth and ethos after 48. And you can see it even in the Hollywood films produced by Americans about how the Israelis are portrayed, and of course how the Arabs are portrayed because of that. So you're not only thinking that the Arabs are maybe primitive, mysterious people, they're also cowards and people who are usually have no chance of winning any kind of a battle. Now, I also remember seeing in one of the many atlases on the history of the conflict that there was always this famous map of 1948. You had thick arrows coming from the Arab world and very thin, hardly discernible arrows coming from the Jewish side to enforce this idea of David and Goliath. Now, looking at the document, it was very clear that there was, at the beginning of the war, a parity in the number of soldiers on both sides, and very early on in the war, the Jews had the upper hand in terms of soldiers, ammunition, logistics, and so on. To this, I should add that we found out that the Israeli government, or the Israeli leadership, had, prior to the war, an agreement with the strongest Arab army, the Jordanian army. And because they had such a good agreement with the strongest Arab army, it meant that it even reduced more the danger from the Arab world to the young Jewish state. And for us, as Israelis, it was important, because it was not just a question whether we were superhumans or not, because there was a very normal explanation why we won the 48 war. But there was also, it was connected to the myth that Israel was under, on the eve of a second Holocaust, on the eve of extermination. It was not. And we found, or I found, that the leaders of the Jews in Palestine knew exactly the balance of power. So they produce an atmosphere of fear, saying that the Jews are under the threat of extermination, in order to raise the mobilization, the commitment of the Jewish community in Palestine. But they knew, in actual terms, that such a danger did not exist. And again, if you think about the American public, it was very important to sell to the American public that Israel is constantly under the danger of being annihilated or exterminated, which blurs or obfuscates any American wish to look at the situation in a more balanced position.
Many people still talk about the so-called generous offer of Camp David II, where Barak and the Israelis were going to give the Palestinians over 90% of the West Bank, and how Arafat and the Palestinians declined.
What Barak was offering in terms of the land deal was, I would say, 80% of the West Bank and Gaza, but not contiguous. Basically, keeping most of the settlements intact and the Israelis living in the settlements in blocks. And so what we were going to have were 3 separate blocks of Palestinians with bypass roads in the middle, sort of bordering as moats around these Palestinian areas. And then in key strategic areas, especially on the borders, we'd have the settlement blocks. And the Jewish settlements and the Jewish population in the settlements would be living this privileged life, as I was talking about, under a completely separate body of law, with total freedom of movement, that block, while the Bantustan would be subject to permits, would be subject to military order, etc. There would not be any viable independence, and the Israelis would still maintain control of the larger picture.
What this map tries to show is in the green, dark green and light green, which are areas A and B, how the Palestinian areas are so carved up into little tiny enclaves. That this is, in a sense, what the Palestinian state would be.
This is certainly not liberation. This is not autonomy. This is not dignity. And of course, the issue of Jerusalem was not clear. And what about the refugees? In Gaza, 80% of the population of Gaza are refugees living in refugee camps. They are not from Gaza. Their homes, their land is from Israel, what is known as Israel today. In the West Bank, there are hundreds and thousands of Palestinian refugees. So if you were going to make a Palestinian state in Gaza, that may liberate the Palestinians who are originally from Gaza, because they got rid of the occupation, but the refugees from Gaza stay in the camps. Plus, the refugees who are living inside Israel. There are about 600,000 Palestinian citizens of Israel today who are what we call internally displaced refugees. They're living in Israeli cities because they were thrown off their lands in what are now probably kibbutzim. So all those issues were just thrown away. And of course the prisoner issue, there was no guarantee of release. And the prisoner issue touches every Palestinian. Almost every Palestinian family has had a family member in prison. Put this all together, Arafat couldn't have signed this. Clinton wanted to go down in history as making this historical agreement. Barak was losing his popularity. He needed this peace agreement to continue. And they both, for political reasons, pushed Arafat. When Arafat said no, Clinton got on Israeli TV and blamed Arafat. And Ehud Barak demonized Arafat. Shlomo Ben Ami blamed it all on Arafat. And a month later we had the Intifada. And from that on, the attempt to exclude Yasser Arafat, an elected leader, from the whole process. The whole idea of this Bantustan was preserving Israeli control and privilege. And you can't maintain this privilege at the expense of others. It just will never work. It may work for a while, but it's not long-lasting. South Africa, apartheid went on for years, decades. I mean, the turn of the century was the first steps of apartheid. Until 1990, it took almost a century to overthrow apartheid.
I use an analogy that people find very useful to make that switch from territory to control. The example of a prison. If you just look at a blueprint of a prison, it looks like the prisoners own the place. They have 95% of the territory. The prisoners have the living areas, they have the cafeteria, they have the work areas, they have the visiting areas, they have the exercise yard. All the prison authorities have is 5%. They have the walls around, they have the bars. Here and there's a few control points, and that's it. In other words, prison authorities do not need 20 or 30 or 40% of the territory of a prison to control the inmates. They only need very strategic points. And that, I think, is a very useful analogy, because Israel does not need more than 5 to 10% to control, to render a Palestinian state less than viable economically and less than sovereign. The Intifada, the resistance, is like a prison riot. And basically the idea is we have the right as prison guards to put this down. These inmates have no right to riot, and they certainly have no right to be violent. And once we put them down, once they know their place, once they submit, and they realize that they're living in a prison, then everything will be fine. But they have to understand where they are and who the guards are.
Me as a Palestinian, I want to live in a free country. I lived in the States, an American citizen. I'm a Palestinian. And I know what's the freedom of mobility, to go from one place to another, to take just your car and drive, and no one will stop you and say, show me your ID. Or you cannot come in this side, you cannot go this side.
Israel is a Jewish state, first and foremost. The basic law on human dignity and freedom, which is of constitutional status, Article 1 says Israel is a Jewish and democratic state. Anything that violates the Jewish character of the state is illegal. So, for example, if I want to run for Knesset, and my platform is a democratic secular state, a non-religious state, a state for all its citizens, I will be banned. If I want to start a non-profit organization, and again, my platform is a secular state, a non-Jewish state, a state for all its citizens, a state like the United States of America. If I want to have a non-profit that advocates implementing the American Constitution in Israel, my non-profit will not be registered. In Israel, it is basically impossible to make political change in a democratic manner if you're advocating equal rights for everyone on every level. You can't do that through the political system or democratically. The settlements are built on confiscated Palestinian land. So just to let settlers stay on Palestinian confiscated land without addressing the wrongs done by the stealing, the theft, doesn't solve a lot of problems, because that has dispossessed so many Palestinians of their livelihood. And you have to remember, the settlements, and especially today, you see it on TV, they're standing army bases, and it's a standing army. It's an Israeli army. They're all armed in the settlements. We're talking about 500,000 armed Israelis.
And then the other issue is water. Settlers are using a tremendous proportion of water resources in the West Bank. The Jordan Valley settlers are sitting on the aquifer that runs along the Jordan River. And settlers in the West Bank are using 40% of the water from that aquifer, although they're in fact maybe 5% of the population in the occupied territories.
The lesson I took from my stay in Auschwitz was anybody belonging to the Jewish people is not allowed to behave ever like our perpetrator, the people who did the thing to us. The Jews were the pioneers of interhuman ethics. And the Jewish idea of how to treat a foreigner, how to treat a servant, which is in the Old Testament, was taken up by nobody less than Jesus Christ. And what is happening now in Israel towards the Palestinians is exactly the opposite. It's exactly the opposite. They treat them like vermin. They talk about them in terms, I mean, like for instance, the chief of staff of the Israeli army recently, the Palestinians are a cancerous growth. I mean, that type of talking is exactly the opposite, and it's actually like Nazi talking. That's what was said about me when I was a boy, a Jewish boy in Germany, under the Nazis.
If the Arabs want to continue to live here peacefully, if they shut up and if they live within the constraints that we give them, it's okay. If they want to be uppity, or if they at all feel that they're a nation with a collective identity, with a counterclaim to this country, then they'll be put down.
Americans really need to be educated because so much of their tax money is being used to oppress the Palestinians and is being used to advance a system of segregation and apartheid that the American people protested and now have declared unacceptable in their own country. And I always say to the Americans, if segregation is unacceptable to you, then why is it acceptable for our brothers and sisters in Palestine, Israel? If you said no then say no now. And say no with your money. Because I have been in Bethlehem for the last 2 weeks, and I know that the Israelis could not have carried out the killings and the destruction without the massive weaponry that they were using against the Palestinians in Bethlehem, without U.S. assistance. Those were American planes bombing us, American Apache helicopters shooting from the sky, M16s, and lots of money funding the Israeli army. Without that money, the Israeli army wouldn't have done what it done. It couldn't have. It doesn't have the money for it.
I want to tell to the American people, we are as a Palestinian people, we are not terrorists. We're a human being like you, but we are suffering in this country here. We are not good. We don't. The people of this country here, then they don't have a good life here.
The rhetoric inside Israel, I think it's prevalent in the United States as well, is of Palestinians willing to sacrifice their children. I mean, willingly sending their children as cannon fodder. That clearly is a even racist understanding of a society. It's clear Palestinians are frantic for the safety of their children.
What's your name?
My name is David. What's your name?
My name is Malik.
Malik?
ايش صورت؟ هلا سلمك على هلو.
Americans can sometimes think and have been told that Palestinian mothers and parents put their children out in front of the bullets on purpose, intentionally.
No, nobody encourage her son or her husband or her brother to be died. No one like this.
We heard this, but nobody wanted children to be dead, All of us love our children. All the Palestinian people, they love their children.
Always they're afraid of this thing to happen. They always say, don't go there, because the soldier maybe push you, shoot you,
This is, you can touch that everybody afraid for his children. But the children, we don't let our children to go.
Not even one encourage her sons,
or children,
her son or children to go there. No.
Here, MIRAGE, she say that her son she love her son much better than she love her eyes, she can give her eyes for her son.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all people are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Try to remember that every single person who is dying because they want to have freedom, they want to have a country where they can live in dignity.
Every individual has that basic b'tselem, that basic human dignity.
The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was framed in the dark shadow of the horrors of World War II, and the international community arrived at the realization that individuals must be protected from oppression and persecution, and that freedom of the individual from fear and want must be ensured. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. No distinction shall be made on the basis of political jurisdiction or international states. Everyone has the right of life, liberty, and security of person. Everyone has the right to freedom of movement and residence in any state. Everyone has the right to a nationality. Because we believe in liberty and justice for all.
كيف حالك؟
كويس.
كويس الحمد لله.